Hey folks, welcome to Daniel chapter 5. We're going to go right into this. Um, and I want to start with a couple of verses from Jeremiah 27, okay? Jeremiah 27, verse 6 and 7 says, "Now I, the Lord, have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and I have given him also the beasts of the field to serve him. All the nations shall serve him and his son and his grandson until the time of his own land comes. Then many nations and great kings shall make him their slave." This is a prophecy that was prophesied decades before Nebuchadnezzar invaded Jerusalem. And now we're basically about 70 years into Daniel's being in captivity. So Daniel's around 80, 85 years old. And so I wanted to point that out because in that verse 7, it says, all the nations shall serve Nebuchadnezzar, his son and his grandson, until the time of his own lands come, or the completion of his rule comes. Then many nations and great kings shall make him their slave. And that's exactly what we're going to see here. Daniel, the book shows us, number one, the character of Daniel. Number two, how the history unfolds itself all the way until the kingdom of God, and regarding future events and the kingdom to come that will last forever. I want to point out that chapter 5, the chapter that we're in, it happens 25 or around there, many years since chapter 4, right? And so we start here in verse 1. And verse 1 says, "And King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the thousands." And so a party is given by Belshazzar. And Belshazzar is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar by his son-in-law, Nabonidus, and Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, Nitocris. Now, there's some historical debate as to whether Belshazzar was actually Nebuchadnezzar's son or grandson. But if you look at antiquities and what has been recorded in history, there's no, you have Nebuchadnezzar, you have Nabonidus, but there's no Belshazzar. And so the question is raised, why is that? And I think this text will give us some evidence as to why that is. Belshazzar is known as a prince or co-regent with Nabonidus, which is Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law, who married his daughter. And so, in a sense, when the word father is used in this text, and we're going to see that in a few verses, it means it's the word for ancestor, okay? And so let's go to verse 2. "Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father," again, that's the Aramaic word for ancestor, not necessarily the word father for father and son, "his father, his ancestor, had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem, be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple of the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone." And so in verse 1 and 2, we see like some arrogant feasting. Arrogant why? Well, by this time they've been surrounded by the kingdoms of the Medes and the Persians. Namely, they've been surrounded by let me get my text right here. They've been surrounded by Darius, right? The king of the Medes. And so Darius is surrounding them. The arrogance caused them to feast, because they think that their fortress is insurmountable, that nobody can conquer the great Babylon. And so Belshazzar is a very arrogant, very prideful ruler, prince, king, co-regent, however you might call it. And this also denotes arrogant feasting, arrogant drinking, an orgy, because they named wives and concubines and lords. The word drinking or drink is the word drunk, again in Aramaic. And so Belshazzar mocked Yahweh by using the vessels of gold and silver that his ancestor Nebuchadnezzar brought. Remember in the very first verse of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar took Daniel and many in exile, but they also took Jehoiakim, the king, and then they also took vessels made of gold and silver from the temple. And it's interesting that in this drinking in verse 4, that they praise the idols of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Isn't that interesting? Those are just like the materials of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, his first dream of the statue, right? And so in verse 5, this is what we find. Immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand that as it wrote. An uninvited guest appears, right? An uninvited guest appears. And so you have to ask yourself, why a human hand? I suppose a human hand because God communicates to us, humans, through human language. A human hand writing human letters, right? Denoting human language. And also maybe because a hand symbolizes crafting or making or molding. No matter the reason, God captured Belshazzar's attention. Listen to verse 6. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. And it wasn't because of the good wine. I can tell you that much for sure. God captures Belshazzar's attention through this writing on the wall. And then he calls loudly to bring his enchanters, his magicians, the Chaldeans, the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and interprets shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and made the third ruler of the kingdom. And so let's talk a little bit about the many things that Babylonians were known for, right? Number one is their legendary power, the legendary fortification of their city, Babylon, the legendary fortress that it was, the legendary hanging gardens, right? One of the seven wonders of the ancient world. They were also known for other things that we haven't talked about yet. Their advancement in mathematics and quadratic equations. The mathematics of the Chaldeans are the source of 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. Their mathematics and arithmetics and geometry are also the source of why we have 360 degrees in a circle. They were known for astronomy, as they were world leaders in the study of heavenly bodies. They were known for commerce and economics, trade, credit, checks, and promissory notes. Yeah, they all originated with the Babylonians. They were expertly committed to the dark arts and magic, which is why Nebuchadnezzar was transfixed on having a whole platoon of soothsayers, magicians, and fortune tellers at his disposal. This tradition passed down to his grandson, and I'm sure his son too, or we can say his son-in-law, Nabonidus. And so he called all of them, promised them rewards and great authority in the kingdom if they were able to interpret his dream. And yet, I mean, the writing on the wall, and yet they all came and none of them could, right? They came and none of them could interpret the writing on the wall. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. Maybe his color change is a euphemism for soiling himself. Maybe not. But it's definitely symbolic of being pale in the face, maybe feeling sick, maybe feeling disturbed in his gut. And then verse 10, the queen reminds him that there was someone, the legendary Daniel, whom it seems Belshazzar wasn't acquainted with the way Nebuchadnezzar was. And she reminded him of this man. I can imagine Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar became friends, right? Because Daniel was in the courts of Nebuchadnezzar all 45 some odd years that he was ruling. But then again, this was around 25 years after the events of chapter 4. And Daniel now is around over 80 years old, right? So Belshazzar, who knows his whereabouts during his youth, but apparently he either didn't recall or didn't know Daniel, or just refused to remember or even honor Daniel as his forefathers honored him, or his ancestor or his father Nebuchadnezzar honored him. She reminded him that there was a man in his courts, in his kingdom, who was filled with the spirit of the holy gods in the way that they understood it. And you can see in verse 12 that Daniel had an amazing reputation among the Chaldeans, even though many magicians hated him and his Hebrew friends, as we've seen in stories in the past. So they called Daniel in verse 12. And then Daniel was brought before the king in 13. King answered and said to Daniel, "You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah." So apparently he had heard of him. He just didn't remember that this guy was the interpreter of dreams, and that was his role. That he was a chief of magicians, appointed by his father or his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar. He brought him in, and he made the same promise in verse 16. I heard that you can give interpretations if you can interpret what's on the wall. I'll honor you with gifts, and I'll also make you the third most powerful in the kingdom. So again, a third ruler there supports the idea that many historians hold that Belshazzar was Nebuchadnezzar's grandson and was co-regent with his father, Belshazzar, with his father, Nabonidus, like I said, who was married to Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, Nitocris. So Belshazzar offers a third place behind himself and his father, Nabonidus, in the kingdom. And Daniel wouldn't interpret. He wouldn't interpret for the honor and the gifts. He said, "Let those gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing and to the king and make known to him the interpretation." That's verse 17. Daniel wouldn't interpret for the honor and gifts. And here's the application point for us. Use your gift, not for what you can get out of it, but because your gift is to be used to honor God and to serve others. And so Daniel ended up interpreting, and I'm just going to skim through 18, 19. He ended up interpreting the dream. But before he does that, he reminds Belshazzar of Nebuchadnezzar's testimony, of his humbling before God in verse 20 and verse 21. And then he tells them, you know, your father, your grandfather Nebuchadnezzar, came to acknowledge that God was the Most High, the ruler of the kingdoms of mankind, and He's the one who sets over it whom He will. Then he accuses Belshazzar of forgetting that in verse 2. You are arrogant and prideful, though you knew about this humbling by Yahweh of your father Nebuchadnezzar. You have not humbled yourself, but you lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. He did this by mocking him. He did this by misusing the vessels that were brought from Jerusalem. You belittled Yahweh and dishonored him by your misuse and abuse of the vessels, verse 23. And then let's shoot to verse 26, right? This is the interpretation of the dream. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And I just want to say that there's a threefold interpretation here. Your days are going to be cut off, right? Your days will be cut off. You have no weight. You have no substance. You know, you've been weighed and found wanting. You're light. You're insignificant. And your kingdom is going to be divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Verse 28. So then verse 29, because Daniel gave the interpretation of the dream, Belshazzar kept his word and rewarded him, clothed him with purple, chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. And history and archaeology places very night as October 12th, 539 BC. And what very night am I talking about? This very night. That very night, because of Belshazzar's pride and arrogance, and he's lifting himself up against God. Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. And so history and archaeology places very night, like I said, at October 12th, 539 BC. Also, again, as we started this section, this brings us again to Jeremiah 27, verse 6 and 7. Now I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. Remember in Daniel 2, the gold head, my servant, God's servant. And I've given him also the beasts of the field to serve him. And the nation shall serve him and his son and his grandson. So 3 generations of Nebuchadnezzar's line, right? Nebuchadnezzar, his son-in-law Nabonidus, and his wife Nitocris, and then his son Belshazzar. Until the time of his own land comes, until they're wiped out, until they're finished, then many nations and great kings shall make him their slave. This is the transition, folks, from the prophecy in Daniel 2 of the statue. This is the transition from the head of gold to the chest and arms of silver. And again, the reminder is for all of us to acknowledge that God is the Most High. He is the King of the universe. He rules over the kingdoms of men, and he raises and lowers the men that he wants to be in the positions of power for his own purposes. May we grasp onto that. We are going to need that in these days. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.